Angela Johnson adjusted the hem of her sleek black dress, the soft fabric hugging her athletic frame. It was her first night out in weeks, and the occasion was important enough to pull her out of her usual workaholic routine. The annual gala for the tech industry's most influential leaders wasn't just a celebration. It was a stage where deals were whispered over glasses of champagne, partnerships were formed in tight handshakes, and reputations were solidified with the perfect photo ops. For Angela, this night was more than just networking. It was a testament to her success. "Miss Johnson, the car's here," Angela's assistant, Michael, called from the doorway of her penthouse. His voice was calm, efficient, but his eyes betrayed a hint of nervousness. Angela nodded, slipping on a pair of towering heels that clicked sharply against the marble floor. She didn't need to prepare a speech or rehearse her story. Everyone in that room already knew who she was. They'd seen her on the covers of business magazines, lauded as a trailblazer who'd gone from a childhood in one of Chicago's most underfunded neighborhoods to the CEO of a billion-dollar tech company. They'd heard her speak at conferences, her commanding voice full of hard-won wisdom. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of that journey. But nothing could have prepared Angela for what was waiting at the doors of the venue. The bright lights of the marquee outside the Velvet Orchid Theater cast a golden glow over the sidewalk as Angela stepped out of the car. Cameras flashed. Photographers snapped shots of the A-listers arriving, but Angela's sharp eyes caught the subtle differences in how the lenses moved. They lingered on the white tech CEOs in custom tuxedos, on the sleekly dressed power couples, but barely flicked in her direction. Angela inhaled sharply, brushing the feeling off. "Let's go," she said to Michael, who followed behind her, holding her clutch and phone. The entrance to the theater was buzzing with activity. Guests in glittering gowns and tailored suits laughed as they handed their tickets to a tall, broad-shouldered security guard stationed at the rope line. Angela approached the man confidently, her invitation in hand, but the moment his eyes landed on her, something in his demeanor shifted. "Name," he barked, his tone clipped. Angela smiled faintly, handing him the gilded invitation. "Angela Johnson. I'm one of the keynote speakers tonight." The guard didn't even look at the invitation. His eyes scanned her from head to toe, lingering on her dark skin and natural curls. His expression was a mix of skepticism and disdain. "This event is for invited guests only," he said flatly. Angela blinked, taken aback. "I am an invited guest," she replied, her voice steady but firm. "That's why I'm handing you this." She gestured to the invitation, still sitting in his hand. "Ticket?" The guard's lips curled slightly, not into a smile, but something colder. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand. We're at capacity. If you don't have clearance from the host..." "Clearance?" Angela interrupted, her eyebrows arching in disbelief. "Are you kidding me? My name is on your guest list." "Check it." Behind her, a group of executives entered the venue with ease. The guard greeted them warmly, calling them by name, letting them pass, without so much as a glance at their tickets. Angela's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, please step aside. You're holding up the line," the guard said, his voice rising. "Excuse me?" Angela said, her voice laced with indignation now. "I am not stepping aside until you confirm my name on that list. I'm here as a keynote speaker. This is beyond unprofessional." The guard folded his arms over his chest, making a show of not caring. By now, a small crowd had gathered behind her. People whispered, some glancing at her with curiosity, others with irritation. "Michael," Angela called over her shoulder to her assistant, her tone sharp. "Can you call the event organizer, please? This is ridiculous." Michael, fumbling with his phone, avoided her gaze as he typed furiously. "I'm trying, ma'am. Let me." "She's not getting in." "It's as simple as that," the guard said, cutting him off. His voice was loud enough now that others in the line stopped to watch. Angela turned back to the man, her chest heaving as anger burned in her throat. She felt the eyes of the crowd boring into her skin, the silent question lingering in the air. Does she belong here? "This is how you treat one of the speakers for tonight's gala," Angela said, her voice slicing through the tension. "Do you even realize how absurd you sound?" The guard smirked, his arrogance on full display. We get all kinds of people trying to sneak into these events, ma'am. It's nothing personal. Angela felt a wave of humiliation crash over her. She stared at the man, struggling to suppress the sting of tears that threatened to rise. You think I'm sneaking in? Her voice broke slightly, the words laced with disbelief. Do you know who I am? The guard chuckled under his breath. Lady, I don't care who you think you are. If you were really supposed to be here, I'd know about it. Angela opened her mouth to respond, but she froze, realizing something deeper about the moment. It wasn't just about the guard refusing her entry. It was about the power dynamics in play, the subtle but deliberate way he was stripping her of her dignity in front of an audience. It was about the fact that no matter how successful she'd become, no matter how many accolades she had under her belt, to him and maybe to others, she was still just a black woman trying to force her way into a room where she didn't belong. Forget it, Angela said finally, her voice low. She turned to Michael, who looked as though he might shrink into the sidewalk from secondhand embarrassment. Let's go. But, Angela, he started, his voice barely above a whisper. I said let's go, she snapped, brushing past him. Her heels clicked loudly against the pavement as she stormed toward the car, each step a mixture of rage and humiliation. Once inside the car, Angela slammed the door and leaned back against the leather seat. For a moment, the only sound was her unsteady breathing. Michael sat stiffly beside her, not daring to speak. Angela stared out the window, her jaw clenched tight. A single tear rolled down her cheek, but she wiped it away with an angry swipe before it could fall. They're going to regret this, she said finally, her voice quiet but laced with steel. Mark my words. The next morning, Angela sat at the head of the long glass conference table in her office, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The sunlight streaming in from the floor-to-ceiling windows illuminated the modern, minimalist space, a reflection of the empire she had built. But today, Angela wasn't basking in her success. Her jaw was set, her expression hard, and her usually calm, measured voice carried a sharp edge as she addressed her senior team. Michael stood by the large monitor at the end of the table, nervously scrolling through an array of headlines from the night before. The words felt like an assault every time Angela glanced at the screen. Tech mogul Angela Johnson barred from VIP gala. Billionaire businesswoman faces racism at prestigious event. Do you know who I am? Angela Johnson's public humiliation. The headlines stung, but they didn't compare to the sting of the moment itself. The guard's smirk, the condescension in his voice, and the way the other attendees had looked at her, some with pity, others with judgment. Angela had replayed it all in her mind during a sleepless night, each time feeling the sharp ache of humiliation. Turn it off, Angela said suddenly, her voice slicing through the tension in the room. Michael scrambled to shut down the screen, his hands fumbling slightly. Angela, he started, but she cut him off with a raised hand. Let me be very clear about something, she said, looking around the table at the faces of her executive team. Some of them were seasoned professionals she'd poached from Fortune 500 companies, while others were people she'd mentored and promoted herself. Regardless of their background, they all wore the same expression, a mixture of unease and anticipation. Angela wasn't angry at them, but her intensity made the room feel 10 degrees colder. What happened last night wasn't just about me, she continued, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of emotion. It wasn't just one ignorant security guard at one event. It was a symptom of something much bigger. Something systemic. The team nodded, but Angela could tell they were still waiting to see where she was going with this. She leaned forward, her gaze piercing. I've spent my entire career proving people wrong, she said. Proving that I deserve to be in the rooms they told me I'd never belong in. But no matter how much success I've achieved, no matter how many barriers I've broken, there are still people who see me and think, she doesn't belong. Last night was a reminder of that. Her voice softened slightly, but the intensity remained. I'm not going to let it slide. I refuse to let it slide. What they did to me isn't just going to fade away like another news cycle. We're going to make a statement. Do you have something in mind? Asked Carmen, her head of PR, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had been by Angela's side for years. Carmen's face was calm, But Angela could see the wheels turning in her mind, already strategizing damage control. Angela nodded.
Yes.
But this isn't about damage control. I don't need to defend myself. I did nothing wrong. This is about changing the narrative. Taking back control. The room was silent for a moment. Then Michael, still standing awkwardly near the monitor, cleared his throat. Angela, he began hesitantly. What are you planning to do? Angela's lips curved into a slight, knowing smile. She let the question hang in the air for a moment, savoring the weight of what she was about to say. I'm going to buy the Velvet Orchid, she said simply. The room erupted in murmurs of surprise and confusion. Carmen raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued but cautious. You want to buy the venue? That's right, Angela replied, sitting back in her chair. I've already contacted my legal team. The owner isn't listed publicly, but I'll find out who they are and make them an offer. Money talks. Angela, that place isn't just any venue, Carmen said carefully. It's one of the most prestigious theaters in the city. It's a landmark. Exactly, Angela said, her voice sharp. It's a symbol of exclusivity, of gatekeeping. And I'm going to take it from them. I'm going to turn it into a place that represents everything they tried to deny me last night. Inclusion, diversity, access. Won't this come across as revenge? Asked Mark, her CFO, who had remained silent until now. His tone wasn't accusatory, but there was a hint of concern in his voice. Angela turned her gaze on him, her expression unyielding. This isn't about revenge, she said firmly. It's about justice. It's about making a point. That guard, the people running that event, they wanted me to feel small, like I didn't belong. I'm going to make sure no one else ever feels that way when they walk through those doors. The room fell quiet again. Carmen, who had been scribbling notes in her leather notebook, finally spoke up. It's risky, she said, but I can see the potential. If we frame this the right way, focus on the message, it could be huge. Angela nodded. Exactly. And I'm not just buying it to make a statement. I want to create something lasting. A space for Black artists, for marginalized voices. A place where people like me don't have to fight to prove they belong. By noon, Angela's legal team was already digging into the Velvet Orchid's ownership records. She spent the afternoon in back-to-back calls with potential investors, pitching the idea with the same fire that had built her empire. Some were hesitant, unsure about the risks of turning such an exclusive venue into a symbol of inclusion. Others, however, were inspired by her passion and signed on immediately. But as the day wore on, Angela began to realize that her plan wouldn't be as simple as cutting a check. The Velvet Orchid's current owner, a man named Henry Cartwright, was notoriously reclusive and had a reputation for being difficult to deal with. Despite her team's best efforts, they couldn't get him on the phone. He's not going to make this easy, Carmen said during an evening strategy session in Angela's office. Angela smirked, her determination unwavering. Good. I don't need it to be easy. I just need it to be possible. That night, Angela stood alone in her penthouse, staring out at the glittering city skyline. She thought about the girl she used to be, the one who had dreamed of moments like the gala, of being celebrated for her brilliance and success. And she thought about the woman she had become, the one who now understood that even success couldn't shield her from prejudice. But Angela wasn't the kind of woman who let pain defeat her. She would channel it, mold it, and use it to build something stronger. Let them underestimate me, she whispered to herself. They won't make that mistake again. The Velvet Orchid sat in the heart of downtown, its Art Deco facade a relic of old-world elegance. Angela studied it from her car, parked across the street, her driver idling silently. By day, the building's grandeur felt less intimidating, its towering columns softened by sunlight. But Angela wasn't here to admire the architecture. She was here to claim it. Her attorney, Vanessa Moore, tapped impatiently at her tablet. So, just to be clear, Vanessa said, her voice crisp, Henry Cartwright has officially refused your offer. He won't sell. Angela turned to her, her expression unreadable. What reason did he give? Vanessa raised an eyebrow. Do you even need to ask? He doesn't think the Velvet Orchid should change hands. He's one of those old money types who thinks selling a property is akin to losing a family heirloom. Sentimental nonsense. Angela leaned back against the leather seat, her fingers drumming against her knee. "It's not nonsense if it gives him leverage," she murmured. "If he won't sell, we need to make him." Vanessa sighed. "Angela, you can't just strong-arm someone into selling their property. This isn't a tech acquisition." Angela's lips curved into a faint smile. "Watch me." Later that afternoon, Angela's team had arranged a meeting with Henry Cartwright at his private estate on the outskirts of the city. She hadn't expected him to agree to it, but something about her persistence must have piqued his curiosity. As Angela stepped into the grand foyer of the Cartwright estate, she immediately felt the weight of history pressing down on her. Family portraits lined the walls, their gilded frames glowing under antique chandeliers. The air smelled faintly of wood polish and aged leather, a scent that carried a certain kind of wealth, old, untouchable, and arrogant. Henry Cartwright was waiting for her in the library, a room that looked as though it belonged in a 19th-century novel. He was seated in a high-backed leather chair, a tumbler of whiskey in one hand and a cigar in the other. "Miss Johnson," he said, his voice smooth but devoid of warmth. He didn't rise to greet her. "I must say, I'm impressed by your persistence. Most people would have taken my refusal as the final word." Angela stepped forward, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. "I'm not most people, Mr. Cartwright." He chuckled a low, dismissive sound. "Clearly." He gestured to the chair opposite him. "Have a seat." Angela sat, crossing her legs and meeting his gaze head-on. "Let's get straight to the point. I want the velvet orchid, and I'm willing to pay above market value for it. You'd be a fool not to take the deal." Henry raised an eyebrow, swirling his whiskey lazily. "You think you can waltz in here and buy your way into something you don't understand? The Velvet Orchid isn't just a building. It's a legacy. A legacy for whom?" Angela shot back, her tone sharp. "For people like me to be humiliated at the door? For a select few to keep feeling superior while the rest of us are shut out? If that's the legacy you're so desperate to protect, then maybe it's time someone else took the reins." Henry leaned back, his expression hardening. "You think you can lecture me about legacy? Let me tell you something, Miss Johnson. That theater has been in my family for generations. My grandfather built it with his own 2 hands. Angela's jaw tightened. She had come here to negotiate, not to lose her temper. But the way Henry spoke, with such entitlement, such casual dismissal of her, made her blood boil. "And what about my family?" Angela asked, her voice low but steady. Henry frowned. "What are you talking about?" Angela reached into her bag and pulled out a faded photograph, placing it on the table between them. It was a black-and-white image of a man standing in front of the Velvet Orchid, a proud smile on his face. "That's my great-grandfather," Angela said. "Jeremiah Johnson. He built the Velvet Orchid. Your grandfather didn't build it, he bought it." After Jeremiah was forced to sell it during the Depression, Henry's eyes narrowed as he picked up the photograph, studying it closely. "I don't know where you got this," he said slowly, "but you're mistaken. My family's name is on the deed. Always has been. That's because your family erased mine," Angela snapped, her voice rising. "Jeremiah's name was on the original deed. But he lost everything because of the racist policies of the time. Banks refusing to lend to black business owners, city officials seizing properties in black neighborhoods. Your family benefited from that system, and now you're sitting here lecturing me about legacy?" Henry set the photograph down, his expression unreadable. For the first time, he looked uncomfortable. "That's ancient history," he said after a long pause. "It's my history," Angela shot back. "And it's not ancient. It's still alive. In every door that's closed in my face, in every room where people like you decide who gets to belong and who doesn't." Henry was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the photograph. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, almost reflective. "I didn't know," he said, "about your great-grandfather. About any of it. You didn't want to know," Angela said. "But now you do. So tell me, Henry, what are you going to do about it?" Over the next week, negotiations intensified. Henry's initial resistance began to waver, though not without struggle. He wasn't the type to admit defeat easily, but Angela's relentless determination, and the weight of the history she had unearthed was impossible to ignore. Carmen, Angela's PR head, worked tirelessly behind the scenes, preparing a media strategy for the moment the acquisition would be announced. "This isn't just a business deal," Carmen said during one of their late-night meetings. "It's a story. A Black woman reclaiming her family's legacy. It's powerful, Angela. People need to hear it." Angela nodded, though her focus remained squarely on the bigger picture. She didn't just want to tell a story. She wanted to create real, lasting change. 2 weeks later, Angela stood in the lobby of the Velvet Orchid, her heels echoing on the marble floors. The theater was officially hers. The deal had been finalized that morning, and the keys were now in her hand. As she walked through the space, she felt a strange mix of emotions: triumph, yes, but also a profound sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about honoring the legacy of her great-grandfather and creating something that would outlast her. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Henry. "Congratulations. You've won. But I hope you understand, this place is yours now, for better or worse. Make it something worth remembering." Angela stared at the message for a long moment before slipping her phone back into her pocket. She would make it something worth remembering. Not for Henry, or for the people who had tried to keep her out, but for herself, and for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. The stage was set. The Velvet Orchid would no longer be a symbol of exclusion. Under Angela's leadership, it would become a beacon of inclusion, diversity, and progress. But the work was just beginning. Angela stood in the center of the Velvet Orchid's grand ballroom, her arms crossed over her chest as she stared up at the massive chandelier. Dust hung in the air, illuminated by the streaks of sunlight coming through the arched windows. The place was quieter than she expected, almost eerie, with the faint smell of mildew lingering in the corners. "This doesn't look very prestigious now, does it?" Carmen muttered as she stepped up beside Angela, holding a clipboard in one hand and her phone in the other. She wrinkled her nose at the cracked plaster on the walls and the faded red carpeting that once screamed luxury, but now looked tired and worn. "It's not about how it looks now," Angela replied, her voice calm but resolute. "It's about what it's going to become." Carmen gave her a skeptical look. "Angela, I get the vision. But have you seen the list of repairs? Plumbing, electrical, HVAC. The place is practically falling apart." She gestured to the clipboard. "The budget for renovations alone is going to cost more than you paid for the building." Angela turned to Carmen, a slight smirk on her lips. "And you think I don't know how to handle a budget? Come on, Carmen. I've built billion-dollar systems from scratch. A little drywall and ductwork won't scare me." Carmen shook her head, muttering something under her breath about how only Angela could describe a multi-million-dollar renovation as a little drywall. "And besides," Angela added, her voice softer now, "this place is worth it. It's worth every dollar, every headache, because once we're done, this will be more than a theater. It'll be a statement. A home for people who've never felt like they belonged." Carmen studied her for a moment before nodding. "All right, let's do it. But you'd better not come crying to me when you realize you've underestimated the cost of restoring that monstrosity of a chandelier." Angela let out a short laugh, her gaze drifting back to the chandelier. "Deal." The first few weeks of renovations were chaotic. Construction crews filled the theater, tearing down old walls, replacing outdated wiring, and hauling out decades of junk that had accumulated in the basement. Angela was on site almost every day, walking through the space with the architects and designers, sketching out her vision in painstaking detail. But not everyone shared her excitement. Late one afternoon, Angela was in the middle of discussing lighting options for the main stage when a familiar voice cut through the noise. Well. Look who's made herself at home." Angela turned to see Henry Cartwright standing in the doorway, his tailored suit looking out of place amid the dust and debris. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and perhaps a hint of resentment. "Henry," Angela said, keeping her tone neutral. "What brings you here?" "I was in the neighborhood," he replied, stepping further into the room. "Thought I'd see what you're doing to my family's theater." It's not your family's theater anymore, Angela said evenly. Henry chuckled, though the sound lacked humor. No, I suppose it's not. But you can't blame me for being curious. You've been making quite the spectacle of this little project of yours. All those interviews, those headlines, Angela Johnson reclaims family legacy. He paused, his gaze narrowing slightly. Funny how you've managed to spin this whole thing into a personal victory. Angela bristled at his tone, but kept her expression composed. It is a personal victory, she said. Not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been made to feel like they didn't belong here. I'm taking something that was stolen from my family and turning it into something better. Something that includes everyone. Henry raised an eyebrow. Stolen, huh? Is that how you see it? That's how it was, Angela shot back. You can dress it up however you want, Henry, but we both know the truth. My great-grandfather built this place, and your family profited off of his loss. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. For a moment, Henry didn't respond. He simply stared at her, his jaw tightening. You think you're the only one with a story, Angela? My grandfather didn't steal anything. He saved this theater from being torn down. He kept it alive when no one else would. And yes, maybe he benefited from a broken system, but he still worked for everything he had. Angela stepped closer, her eyes blazing. And what about the people who didn't have the luxury of working within that system? What about the people who were pushed out, shut out, erased? Don't stand there and tell me your family's success wasn't built on the backs of people like mine. Henry's face darkened, but before he could respond, Carmen appeared at Angela's side, clearing her throat awkwardly. Angela, she said, her tone carefully polite, the contractors have some questions about the stage renovations. Angela nodded, her gaze still locked on Henry. I'll be right there, she said, her voice tight. Henry watched her for a moment longer before turning toward the door. Good luck, Angela, he said over his shoulder. You'll need it. That night, Angela sat alone in her office, staring at an old photograph of her great-grandfather Jeremiah. The picture showed him standing in front of the velvet orchid, his expression proud and full of hope. Angela traced her finger over the edges of the photograph, her mind racing with memories of the stories her grandmother used to tell about Jeremiah. How he'd saved every penny he earned to build the theater. How he'd poured his heart into creating a space where Black performers could showcase their talent without fear of discrimination. And how it had all been taken away from him, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. Angela clenched her jaw, a wave of determination washing over her. She wasn't just doing this for herself. She was doing it for Jeremiah, for her grandmother, for everyone who had come before her. The Velvet Orchid wasn't just a theater. It was a legacy, and she would honor it, no matter how many Henry Cartwrights tried to stand in her way. 2 months into the renovations, the transformation of the Velvet Orchid was already beginning to take shape. The crumbling walls were replaced with vibrant murals by local Black artists. The stage was expanded to accommodate larger performances, while the once exclusive VIP lounge was converted into a community space where up-and-coming performers could network and collaborate. Angela insisted on being involved in every decision, from the seating layout to the programming schedule. Her vision was clear. The Velvet Orchid would be a place of inclusion, creativity, and empowerment. But even as the project moved forward, the challenges kept coming. Henry continued to make public statements questioning her motives, calling her transformation of the theater a publicity stunt. Investors grew wary of the mounting renovation costs, and whispers of doubt began to circulate in the media. Through it all, Angela remained steadfast. She had faced worse before, and she knew the fight was far from over. By the end of the 4th month, Angela stood in the middle of the newly refurbished theater, taking it all in. The space was unrecognizable from the dilapidated building she had walked into months ago. It was alive now, vibrant and full of promise. But Angela knew the hardest part was still to come, proving that the Velvet Orchid wasn't just a vanity project, but a true catalyst for change. And she was ready. The night of the grand reopening of the Velvet Orchid had arrived, and the theater was unrecognizable from the dusty, outdated venue Angela had first walked into months ago. Every detail gleamed with purpose. The lush new carpeting, the restored Art Deco moldings, and the massive chandelier that now sparkled like a crown jewel. Angela had spared no expense, not because she wanted to flaunt her wealth, but because she wanted the space to feel like a celebration of everything it stood for: creativity, diversity, and resilience. Guests began arriving as the doors opened. A mix of well-known artists, activists, and community members stepped into the space, their reactions ranging from awe to visible emotion. The red carpet outside the theater buzzed with reporters and photographers, eager to capture the story of Angela Johnson reclaiming her family's legacy. Inside, Angela stood at the back of the main auditorium, her hands clasped tightly as she observed the crowd. For the first time in months, she wasn't directing contractors, arguing with investors, or sparring with Henry Cartwright in the press. Tonight wasn't about any of that. It was about honoring the vision her great-grandfather had for this space and the legacy she was building on top of it. Angela. She turned to see Carmen standing beside her, a rare smile on her face. The press is asking for you. They want a statement before the show starts. Angela hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the stage.
Not yet, she said.
Let them wait. I need a moment. Carmen gave her a knowing look but nodded. I'll hold them off. Take your time. As Carmen disappeared into the crowd, Angela let out a slow breath. The weight of the past few months, the late nights, the public scrutiny, the financial risks, pressed against her chest. She had done it. She had turned a symbol of exclusion into a beacon of hope. But the question lingered in her mind. Was it enough? The lights in the auditorium dimmed as the opening performance began. Angela had chosen a lineup of artists who reflected the theater's new purpose: young, diverse performers who had spent years being overlooked by the industry. The first act was a spoken-word poet, a young Black woman who recited a powerful piece about identity and belonging. Her words echoed through the theater, drawing audible gasps and applause from the audience. Angela watched from the shadows, her chest swelling with pride. This was exactly what she had envisioned, a space where voices that had been silenced could finally be heard. Beautiful, isn't it? Angela turned at the sound of the familiar voice. Henry Cartwright was standing a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. What are you doing here? Angela asked, her tone neutral but guarded. Henry shrugged. I was invited. Figured I'd come see what you've done with the place. Angela studied him for a moment, unsure of his intentions. I'm surprised you'd want to. You've made it pretty clear you don't approve of what I'm doing here. Henry sighed, his gaze drifting to the stage where the poet had just finished her performance. I didn't approve because I didn't understand, he admitted. I thought you were trying to erase everything my family built. But seeing this, he gestured to the theater, his voice trailing off. You didn't erase anything. You gave it meaning. Angela was taken aback by his words. For months, Henry had been a thorn in her side, a symbol of everything she was fighting against. Hearing him acknowledge her efforts felt strange. I'm not doing this for your approval, Angela said, her voice firm. I know, Henry replied. And that's exactly why it worked. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The applause from the audience filled the silence, punctuated by the hum of anticipation for the next act. I've been thinking about what you said, Henry continued, his tone more reflective now. About legacy, about the choices my grandfather made, and the ones I've made. I didn't want to admit it, but you were right. This place never truly belonged to my family. It always belonged to yours. Angela felt a lump rise in her throat, but she pushed it down, unwilling to let herself get emotional in front of him. It's not about whose name is on the deed, she said quietly. It's about what we do with it. And I'm not finished yet. Henry nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. Well, for what it's worth, I think Jeremiah would be proud. Angela blinked, startled to hear him say her great-grandfather's name. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Henry turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. As the night went on, Angela finally stepped onto the stage to deliver her closing remarks. The audience erupted into applause as she approached the microphone, their energy electrifying the space. Angela held up a hand, signaling for quiet, and the room fell into a hush. Thank you, she began, her voice steady, but filled with emotion. Thank you for being here tonight, and for believing in what this place stands for. She paused, glancing around the theater, taking in the faces of the people who had come to support her vision. The Velvet Orchid has a complicated history, she continued. It's been a place of celebration, but also a place of exclusion. For years, it was a symbol of who was allowed in and who was kept out. But tonight, we begin a new chapter. Her voice grew stronger, more resolute. This space isn't just a theater. It's a promise. A promise that everyone deserves a place to shine. That talent, passion, and creativity have no boundaries. That no matter where you come from, no matter what you look like, you belong. The audience erupted into applause, but Angela wasn't finished. This isn't just about me or even my family, she said. It's about all of us. It's about reclaiming our stories, rewriting our narratives, and building something better for the next generation. And I promise you, this is only the beginning. The crowd rose to their feet, their applause thunderous. Angela stepped back from the microphone, her heart pounding in her chest. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. Later that night, as the theater emptied and the lights dimmed, Angela walked through the now silent space. She paused in front of the stage, running her fingers over the polished wood. In her mind's eye, she could see her great-grandfather standing there, his face full of pride and hope. She smiled, feeling his presence as though he were standing beside her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the empty room. "For starting this. For giving me something to fight for." As she turned to leave, Angela knew this was only the beginning. The Velvet Orchid would continue to grow, to inspire, to challenge the status quo. And so would she. The story ends not with a finality, but with a sense of possibility. Angela's journey is far from over, but she's proven one thing. No matter how many doors are closed in her face, she will always find a way to build her own.